particularly relevant right now because women have been hit so hard by the pandemic, leaving the workforce in greater numbers. Pay gaps have not made any progress towards closing. And I think back at when I was 13 years old, and my mom, who grew up in the 50s and 60s, she told me that by the time I grew up, men and women would be on equal footing in the workplace. She was absolutely wrong. I believed her. I thought she was right. I thought it was obvious because women had made so much progress since when she was growing up, and her choices were to become either a teacher or a nurse. That's what she felt like her professional options were. And for me, I felt like the world was going to be my oyster. I was disappointed and sort of surprised to see how much the business world was dominated by men when I entered the workforce as a young reporter for Fortune magazine. And that's when I realized that yes, men and women may be in the workforce in more equal numbers, but the fact that the C-suite is dominated by men really means that there's so much more work to do for men and women to get anywhere near to equality or equity in the workplace. Women are by definition exceptional when it comes to leadership of major American companies. Female CEOs represent just 8% of Fortune 500 CEO roles, and that's actually an all-time high. So I was struck as a journalist in the business world for 23 years, 6 years first at Fortune magazine and 16 and a half years now at CNBC. I was interviewing CEOs, meeting CEOs through my work, and I saw that women were very much in a tiny minority. And perhaps more interesting, though, is that they seem to be approaching challenges and problems in a different way. And so I thought, yes, they are exceptions to the rule, but maybe they're also exceptional because they've been able to defy the odds to be in that tiny minority of women who make it into those top positions. I was particularly interested by the technology space, and that's because there, women seem to face even higher bars, higher challenges than in other sectors. In the venture capital space, about $330 billion was invested in the US in startups last year. 2% of that went to companies with female founders. A slightly larger percent went to companies with both male and female founders, but 82% of all venture capital dollars went to companies with all male founding teams. So I thought, talk about exceptional, the women who are able to secure that 2% of venture funding and then go on to grow and scale startups, which is a hard thing to do for either men or women. Those women are definitely exceptional. And I figured if they can defy those odds, they must have leadership lessons that would be valuable not just for women, but for everyone. In business, for many years, people talked about the importance of IQ, smarts. Then there was empathy quotient, EQ. And then there's something else called adaptability quotient. And this is an ability to be watching numbers, watching data, seeing how things are changing, and then have the ability to make adjustments and adapt. Not based on your own ideas about what's going to happen, but based on the numbers and the data. And there's a lot of research showing that people actually believe that female leaders are more adaptable, more quickly able to pivot and let go of their plan, not be stuck. So with this idea of an adaptability quotient, women actually rank very high in adaptability in studies of female leaders versus male leaders. And adaptability is essential because it's not just about the ability to be good at something, it's the ability to read the data, to frequently consider data, and be willing to drop your original plan and switch strategies when the data indicates that that's what's the best thing to do. So I found this to be a very strong characteristic among many of the women I interviewed. I was lucky to be able to report this book during the pandemic, the greatest test of leadership in business of our time, the greatest test of leadership in business, I would say, since World War II, probably. So what was so interesting here is I was watching in real time as these CEOs had to figure out how much they were going to stay the course, try to stick with their business as it was, or they were going to figure out how to best adapt to the situation. When I think about a high adaptability quotient, there are many women in my book who demonstrate this, particularly when it comes to the challenges of the pandemic. But one woman I think about in particular is Karen Seidman Becker, the CEO of a company called Clear. Clear is a biometrics company that helps people move quickly through the airport. And weeks before a global pandemic was declared, she was starting to see indications that global travel was going to come to a screeching halt. So long before airports really started to shut down, she decided to slash the spending for the company for the entire year. $24 million was intended to be spent on advertising, and she slashed the entire ad spend for the year earlier than many thought that she would have, because she was looking at the data, looking at indications around travel, and realized that this was not the time to spend any money on marketing. So she sort of got ahead of the game because she was watching the data around travel. Similarly, in December of 2020, she started to see indications based on travel data that there would be an uptick in demand for her services. So she ramped up hiring, aggressively not only rehired everyone who had worked for the company, but started hiring new people to meet what she anticipated would be demand. So she was following the data and figuring out how to get ahead of that data and make changes to her company. But one thing that I think is most remarkable about Karen is that during the pandemic, she transitioned Clear from being all about travel to being about health and access. You may have used a Clear Pass on your phone to get into a conference or get into an event or even get into your office. So she had had a little bit of investment before the pandemic in health technology and using biometrics for both health screening and health identity. And as soon as she saw that the pandemic was going to be a pandemic, she really started doubling down, tripling down on this area to make Clear more than just a travel company. And more than a year before the vaccine was widely available, she had already started figuring out how to use Clear as a health pass that would connect to your vaccine records. So she was able to look around corners, to plan ahead, because she was so focused not on her original plan, but on responding to the data and the opportunity that the data would show her. There's this idea of divergent thinking versus convergent thinking, and a researcher named Barbara Annis says that women are more likely to do divergent thinking. That means pulling in perspectives from across an organization, but also pulling on threads that may seem tangential to solving a problem, but may actually give you a bigger picture idea of what the problem is that you're solving. So while men might be driving quickly towards a solution, women might say, hey, but what about these other things that give us a broader sense of the big picture? So I think about this with Toyin Ajayi. She's the CEO of a company called City Block Health, and she's trying to help improve the health outcomes for patients, low-income patients who are often going in and out of emergency rooms and really weighing on the healthcare system. But she said we can't just help patients by treating their symptoms and sending them back out into the streets. We have to look at the big picture. Let's figure out the entirety of their healthcare situation. Let's not just rush to solve for the problem. Let's think what's going to make them healthier over the long run. So now City Block Health helps their patients with things like housing and social services to make sure that the patient isn't just getting a Band-Aid, but is going to be healthier over the long run. Another example of this is a CEO of a company called Spring Health named April Coe. She was interested in trying to use data to try to help with mental health care. And so a lot of mental health care is done by psychologists and psychiatrists, and it's a very personal experience. But she said if we can get data about everything that works for patients, their sleep habits, their exercise habits, the exact circumstances in which they took certain pharmaceuticals, all of that data could be used to provide a big picture, a big divergent picture of all the different things that play into mental health care and actually helping someone get better. So it's not just about the tree and helping in a specific tree, but women increasingly look at the big forest surrounding the tree to figure out how to make that specific tree healthier or stronger or better. Because there's such a dominant stereotype of what a leader looks like, and it is archetypically a white man, a lot of the women I spoke to said they didn't feel like they had to do things the same way as their male counterparts because they already didn't fit the mold. I think about Jennifer Holmgren. She's the CEO of a company called LanzaTech that turns pollution into fuel. This is a crazy moonshot idea, but she has the technology that makes it happen. And this was something that she was willing to pursue, even though people told her it would never happen, it would never be accepted by the factories that have to adopt her technology to capture the pollution when it's coming out of the factory. But she said, no one ever expected anything of me anyways. She was a Colombian immigrant. She's an introvert. She doesn't like to talk loudly in meetings. And she said, I just do things my own way because no one ever expected anything of me, so they don't expect me to fit a box. And by being able to and empowered to do things in her own way, she felt like she could not only lead differently, but also solve something like turning pollution into fuel differently as well. There's a lot of data about how vulnerability is incredibly valuable for leaders. It makes them more approachable by their employees, and it also encourages employees to share their ideas and to help contribute to problem solving and building a company's assets. One thing I heard from Gwyneth Paltrow, who's been incredibly successful with Goop, is that not only did her vulnerability in the content that she shared help, but also she uses vulnerability in her management of Goop. So one moment that was a tipping point for Goop was when Gwyneth Paltrow got out there and she talked about how she had suffered from postpartum depression. Here was this movie star who didn't seem to have any problems in the world. She was being incredibly vulnerable about her own challenges. That made her relatable, accessible in a way that she probably wasn't before. Similarly, she found as she was taking on more control over running Goop, she only became CEO several years into the company's operations, she started asking questions about things she didn't understand, such as acronyms in meetings. And she found as she started asking those questions that it invited other people to ask questions as well. And it enabled everyone to participate in a meeting in a way that many people had been worried about asking questions and maybe not revealing they didn't know exactly what the COO or another executive was talking about. Female entrepreneurs are more likely to launch purpose-driven companies. These are companies that want to attain a social or environmental good in addition to attaining profits. So having a social or environmental good is incredibly valuable for companies when they're trying to attract employees and retain those employees, give those employees a sense of mission, especially in tough times, such as like what we just went through with the pandemic. It's also attractive to customers, especially if you're a consumer-facing company, to have that social or environmental good baked in as well. And also with investors, as we see an increasing focus on ESG. So female founders are more likely to be focused here in that purpose-driven space. And there's also data that these purpose-driven companies can outperform. A number of the women I talked to who were working on these purpose-driven companies, such as Shivani Soroya, who has a company called Tala that does microloans, or Christine Mosley, who has a company called Full Harvest that's focused on food waste. I asked them why they decided to launch these as companies and not as not-for-profits. There are various endeavors in the same space trying to tackle similar issues, but through the guise of being a nonprofit rather than being a for-profit company. And both of them said to me, there is massive financial opportunity if we can tackle these problems, tackle these challenges as a for-profit company, and our ability to impact change is going to be much bigger. They also said they want to show the value in aligning as a for-profit company and also having a benefit to society or the environment. And they think the more that they can have those two things be closely aligned, the more successful they'll be. You know, we talk a lot in society about double standards, higher bars that women have to meet, but there's actually data about this idea of gender incongruity. If someone doesn't fit a stereotype, if someone doesn't fit into what you expect of them, then they're more likely to be criticized or judged harshly. There's a professor named Victoria Brescal who looks at the way people are judged more harshly if they're in roles that are not considered gender congruent. So for instance, a female police chief, she's going to be judged far more harshly than a male police chief because people who are used to the pattern of seeing male police chiefs are saying, hey, this person doesn't fit my stereotype, doesn't fit the pattern of what I expect for them in this role. So women are effectively expected to be more nurturing and caring. And when they are succeeding in roles that are traditionally male, they're often criticized for that. And they're also criticized if they don't act nurturing and caring. So one of the people I interviewed said, it's not just a double standard, it's a double bind. Women have to succeed both in male characteristics, they also have to show their female characteristics, and no matter what they do, they face this extra scrutiny because they are in the minority. There's a theory called token theory, where if you aren't used to seeing someone, if someone is in a minority group, you're going to be focused on them and perhaps criticizing them more harshly because you're just not used to seeing them. So ultimately, the fact that women are judged more harshly has nothing to do with their talents or abilities and everything to do with the fact that they're still unusual in these leadership roles. It's not rational and it's not fair. There's a lot of data that indicates that we are a far, far way from gender equity. There are studies showing that women are judged more harshly on everything from using humor in the workplace to giving feedback in the workplace. There are so many challenges for women in the workplace, especially right now. But here's why I'm incredibly optimistic. Despite the fact that last year women got 2% of all venture capital funding and are only 8% of the CEOs of the Fortune 500, I am incredibly optimistic because the data show that when women are in leadership positions, when more women are on boards, when more women are in the C-suite, companies are more successful. All of the data, whether it's about gender diversity or racial diversity, indicates that more diverse companies simply perform better. I believe that venture capital investors care about making money. I think investors in public markets care about making money. And the more they're aware of all of this data that indicates the financial opportunity in diversity, they'll see that it's not a nice to have. It's not a philanthropic endeavor to put women into more leadership roles. It is a financial imperative. Spending years poring over all of this research shows one thing. Every piece of data indicates the financial opportunity in diversity. And there's one more thing here. Looking at the risks of recession, the fact that we're facing record inflation, so much uncertainty in the business world right now, I think about the challenges that women have always faced and the way they've coped with them, having to do more with less, having to be scrappy, having to bring in perspectives from across an organization. All of these approaches that women have either been forced to do or have had the impulse to do, those are things that are going to be incredibly valuable right now to navigate these uncertain times.